The sky cracked open in fire. It started with a hum, barely noticeable at first, like a whisper riding the wind. Then came the thunder, a deep, guttural roar that rolled across the heavens as if the gods themselves had split the void. The first bomb fell in the heart of Neo Vega, a sleek, towering city of glass and steel that had once been humanity's proudest off-world colony. It struck with the fury of an angry sun, a blinding sphere of white-hot plasma that melted everything in an instant. Skyscrapers crumbled, bridges vaporized, and streets turned into rivers of molten rock. And that was only the beginning. The attack came without warning. No declaration of war, no demands, no threats. Just fire, destruction, and death. The orbital bombardment was relentless, turning the city into a graveyard before the first emergency broadcasts could even finish. The sky rained hellfire as the Threx Dominion, an empire of war-hardened conquerors, unleashed its wrath without hesitation. They wanted a massacre, not a war. In the control bunker beneath what used to be the United Earth Alliance's headquarters, General Kai Mercer stood with his hands clenched into fists, his body covered in dust and blood. The room around him was chaos. Holographic displays flickered with emergency alerts. Officers shouted over one another, and the metallic tang of smoke filled the air. But Kai heard none of it. His eyes were locked on the city above, displayed on a massive screen before him. Neo Vega was dying. He accessed his neural uplink and data poured into his mind. The colony's automated defenses had been crushed in the first wave. Over 90% of their orbital platforms were gone. The few remaining gunships were barely managing to evacuate civilians before getting shot out of the sky. Casualties were already in the millions. The Threx didn't just want to win. They wanted to erase Neo Vega from existence. A younger officer, barely out of his 20s, turned to Kai with wide, terrified eyes. "Sir, we have to surrender. There's nothing left to fight with." Kai turned to face him, and for the first time the officer saw the cold, unwavering steel in his superior's gaze. "Surrender?" Kai repeated, his voice calm, almost too calm. "They bombed us without warning. They executed civilians from orbit, and you think surrender will make them stop?" The officer swallowed hard. We don't have a choice." Kai stepped forward until he was close enough for the young man to see the faint glow of his neural implants under his skin. "There is always a choice." His voice was ice. "And they just made theirs." He turned away, accessing the bunker's classified systems with a thought. His neural link pulsed, and deep beneath the city something stirred, something the Threx had no idea existed. Project Titan, a secret program buried beneath the crust of Neo Vega, hidden from even the highest-ranking officials of the United Earth Alliance. It had been built for one purpose, and one purpose only: retribution. The chamber rumbled as the security protocols unlocked. A deep mechanical hiss echoed through the facility, and the massive blast doors at the far end of the room began to slide open. Steam poured from the entrance, illuminated by the eerie glow of the containment units inside. They weren't just machines. The Titans were something else, something far worse. Towering war constructs, each the size of a city block, their frames pulsed with energy far beyond human technology. These weren't mindless drones or clunky battle mechs. They were symbiotic weapons, designed to merge with their pilots at a fundamental level, to become one. Kai had been part of their creation, had witnessed firsthand what they could do. Each Titan required a human host, not to control it, but to become it. The neural interface didn't just link thoughts to metal, it fused them, rewrote them. Flesh and steel ceased to be separate things. The pilots of the Titans didn't command their machines. They were. And now it was time to wake them up. Kai stepped forward, stripping off his battered jacket, revealing the intricate web of neural implants lining his spine. He reached out, placing his hands on the activation panel, and the moment his skin touched the surface, a shockwave of energy surged through his body. His mind expanded. The world around him blurred, and for a moment he wasn't standing in a bunker beneath a ruined city. He was everywhere. The data streams of the Titans flooded into him, their dormant minds waking as they recognized him, not as their pilot, but as part of themselves. Power surged through his veins. He could feel the weight of his new form, the sheer impossible mass of it. His vision no longer came from human eyes, but from 1,000 different sensors, each one painting a new image of reality. He flexed his fingers, and somewhere above the bunker, a massive metallic hand mirrored his movements. He was no longer Kai Mercer. He was a Titan. The other pilots followed, stepping into their own interfaces, their minds vanishing into the war machines like ghosts into a shell. One by one, the Titans awoke, their towering frames illuminated by the fires of Neo-Vega. Above them, the Threx fleet still loomed. The warships hovered in orbit, their massive cannons glowing as they prepared for another wave of destruction. They still thought the battle was over, that Neo-Vega was finished. Kai's voice echoed through the Titan network, resonating in the minds of his fellow pilots. "They think this is done." His voice was calm, controlled, but beneath the surface there was something else, something dark. "They think we're weak." His Neuralink pulsed, the Titans moved. They just made the worst mistake of their lives. The first Titan launched into the sky with a thunderous boom, breaking through the atmosphere like a comet. The others followed, their massive forms defying gravity, streaking toward the enemy fleet at impossible speeds. On board the Threx flagship, Warlord Zero-Scan watched in silence as his sensors detected the impossible. His fleet had already begun preparing to leave, the battle already considered won. But now something was coming. His second-in-command turned, eyes wide with disbelief. "My lord, they are—" A tremor shook the ship, not from an impact, but from the sheer force of what was approaching. Then they saw them. The Titans erupted from the planet's surface, each one glowing with energy that defied reason. They weren't just machines. They moved like living things, fluid, fast, unnatural. Zero-Scan had seen countless war machines in his time, but never anything like this. One of the Titans raised its arm, and before the warlord could react, a pulse of blue energy surged forward, striking one of the Threx battlecruisers. There was no explosion, no debris. The ship simply vanished. Zyros's cold reptilian heart clenched. This was not a battle anymore. This was vengeance. The Threx fleet opened fire. Plasma cannons, missile barrages, energy lances, all of it lit up the void, a storm of destruction meant to crush any resistance. But the Titans moved. They wove through the onslaught with terrifying speed, their bodies twisting through space with an elegance that no machine should have possessed. Then the slaughter began. One Titan tore through a Threx warship with its bare hands, rending metal apart as if it were paper. Another formed a blade of pure energy and carved through 3 ships in a single motion. Kai focused on the flagship. His Titan's core pulsed, energy crackling through its limbs. He could feel the Threx commander watching him, could sense the fear beginning to fester. He smiled. "You thought we were insects." His voice carried across every Threx communication channel, a whisper laced with fire. "You thought we'd beg." His Titan raised both arms, and the energy within him surged forward in a massive blast, a sphere of raw annihilation. The flagship never stood a chance. It was there one moment and gone the next, a brilliant explosion scattering debris into the void. The remaining Threx ships turned to flee. Kai let them run, for now. He turned back toward Neo-Vega, his Titan standing tall against the wreckage of the battlefield. The war had just begun. The Threx fleet shattered like glass before a storm. The sky, once painted with the streaks of their bombardment, was now alight with the fire of their own destruction. Warships, once symbols of their dominance, now drifted as lifeless husks through the void, debris scattering like embers in the wind. But for General Kai Mercer, the battle was far from over. He could feel the remnants of their forces retreating, scrambling to escape the massacre they had unwittingly provoked. They had come expecting slaughter. They had expected to wipe out a colony of helpless civilians, to erase Neo-Vega from existence, as they had done to countless others. Instead, they had awoken something far worse. Kai stood at the heart of his Titan, feeling the weight of its massive form as if it were his own body. The connection was seamless now. There was no distinction between man and machine. The Titan's systems pulsed through him, its weapons felt like an extension of his will, its strength indistinguishable from his own. He had never felt power like this before. Not just raw strength, but an overwhelming presence, an undeniable certainty that he was no longer bound by the same rules as before. He turned his attention to the remaining Threx vessels, their engines burning bright as they fled toward the far side of the system. How typical. They had been so confident, so assured of their supremacy, yet the moment the tide shifted, they ran. There was no honor in them, no resilience, only the cold, calculating instinct of a predator that had just realized it was not, in fact, at the top of the food chain. Kai could have pursued them immediately. The Titans were fast, far faster than anything the Threx could have anticipated. Even now, his targeting systems were painting possible interception routes, calculating how quickly he and the others could run them down. But he forced himself to pause. He had been a soldier long enough to know that raw vengeance. The voice of one of his officers, Lieutenant Sarna Vale, crackled through his comms. Her Titan hovered just beside his, its angular frame still glowing from the energy it had unleashed upon the enemy fleet. "Do we chase them down?" she asked, her voice steady but with an edge of hunger beneath it. She wanted this as much as he did. Kai didn't answer immediately. His mind ran through the possible outcomes. Destroying the remaining ships would be satisfying, but it wouldn't be enough. They needed to send a message, one that would not just make the Threx fear them, but make them understand what they had unleashed. "No," he finally said. "Let them run." A pause. Then Sarna's voice again, uncertain. "Sir?" Kai's eyes burned as he watched the Threx vessels shrink in the distance. They need to carry the story of what happened here. They need to tell their leaders, tell their warlords, if we wipe them out now, the Dominion will only see it as an unfortunate loss. He leaned forward, feeling the power humming through his Titan's systems. But if we let them live, they will spread fear through their entire empire. They will whisper our names in the dark, wondering if we are coming for them next. Silence followed, then a low chuckle. Sarna understood now. "You always were the patient one," she said. "All right, we let them crawl home with their tails between their legs. But this isn't over, is it?" Kai's hands curled into fists. "Not even close." He turned his gaze downward toward the scorched remains of Neo-Vega. The fires were still burning, the wreckage of the once thriving city a cruel reminder of what had been lost. Even with the Threx in retreat, the air was thick with smoke and grief. Thousands, millions were dead, their families, their futures, their lives, all taken in an instant by an enemy that hadn't even considered them worth a declaration of war. His comms crackled again, this time with the voice of Commander Elias Brand, one of the few surviving high-ranking officers from the original military division stationed in Neo-Vega. "General Mercer," Brand said, his voice hoarse, "we've got civilians scattered across the city, survivors. We're doing what we can to pull them out of the wreckage, but we're low on medical supplies, and a lot of the infrastructure is gone." Kai felt the weight of those words settle over him. His Titan's sensors swept across the ruins, highlighting life signs buried beneath the debris, heat signatures flickering like dying embers. The battle might have been won, but the true struggle, the fight to rebuild, to survive, was only just beginning. "We'll deploy every remaining unit to assist in the rescue," Kai said. "Send me coordinates. I'll clear the larger obstacles myself." A moment later, his Titan's display filled with markers, each one representing another group of survivors trapped beneath the wreckage. Some of them were civilians, others were soldiers who had managed to hold out against impossible odds. He felt a flicker of respect for them. Even without Titans, even without a chance in hell, they had fought. They had refused to surrender. He moved without hesitation. His Titan's massive hands tore through collapsed structures, lifting entire sections of fallen buildings as if they weighed nothing. Below, emergency teams rushed in, pulling the wounded to safety, patching up those they could, marking the lost for later retrieval. It was brutal, grueling work, but it had to be done. Hours passed. The fires began to die down. The screams grew softer, fading into the background hum of machinery and whispered prayers. Neo Vega was broken, but it was not dead. Not yet. And neither was he. As the final survivors were pulled from the wreckage, Kai finally allowed himself a moment to stop, to stand amidst the ruins of the city he had sworn to protect. His Titan loomed above him, a silent guardian against the night. He had won the battle, but he knew, deep in his bones, that this was just the beginning. The Threks would regroup, they would come back, and when they did, they would not find a colony waiting for extermination. They would find Titans, they would find vengeance, and they would learn, far too late, that some enemies should never be made. The darkness of space stretched infinitely before the fleet of battered Threks warships, their sleek predatory forms limping through the void. Their once proud banners, gleaming insignias of the Dominion's military might, were now scorched and barely visible, their hulls marred with the wounds of a battle they should have won. The silence within the flagship was heavy, broken only by the occasional hiss of damaged systems struggling to recover. Warlord Zyros sat in his command throne, his claws gripping the armrests with a force that threatened to shatter the reinforced metal. His reptilian features, usually unreadable even to his own kind, were twisted into something rare in disbelief. He had never known true fear, not in all his conquests, not even when he had stood before the supreme dominator himself. But now, something clawed at his mind, something he could not dismiss as weakness. The human, the insignificant, primitive race that his people had always deemed unworthy of serious consideration. They had been a species to conquer, to crush beneath the might of the Dominion, a people whose place in the universe was either as slaves or as dust. And yet, in a single battle, they had not only fought back, they had annihilated his fleet, shattered his confidence, and left him fleeing like a coward. It was impossible. The Dominion's intelligence had spoken of human military capabilities. They had fleets, yes, armies, but nothing like that. Nothing like those monstrous machines that moved with the grace of gods and the fury of demons. He had watched his ships fold in on themselves, torn apart by forces beyond his comprehension. He had seen his warriors, his best, fall without even understanding what had struck them. Zyros Khan exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. His second-in-command, a younger Threks officer named Valric, stood before him, his own expression tight with restrained panic. "My lord," Valric said carefully, "our surviving vessels have entered the safe zone beyond the human system. We can return to the Dominion stronghold and—" "Silence," Zeroskan growled. Valric stiffened, lowering his gaze, but he did not retreat. That was one thing Zeroskan respected about him. Unlike the others in his crew, Valric had backbone. It was why he had not been executed for failure. The warlord slowly rose from his throne, his heavy footfalls echoing across the dimly lit bridge. He walked to the central display, where the final battle recordings flickered in holographic form before him. There they were again. Those Titans, the war machines that had turned the tide in an instant. He stared at them, watching how they moved, how they reacted with a precision that no normal machine should have possessed. "These are no simple constructs," Zeroskan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "They are something else." "My lord," Valric said hesitantly, "I do not believe they are merely machines. Our scans indicated—" He paused, uncertain. "We detected biological signatures within them, not pilots in a traditional sense, but something fused." Zyroski's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. A horrifying possibility was forming in his mind. The humans had not merely built advanced war machines, they had become them. He turned sharply to Valric. "Prepare a transmission. Secure channel. I am contacting the Supreme Dominator." Valric's eyes widened. "My lord, to bypass the standard..." "I will not explain myself twice," Zeroscan snapped. Valric bowed his head and hurried to obey. Moments later, the bridge darkened as the holotransmitter activated. A swirling mass of shadows and golden light formed in the air, shifting, pulsing, and finally solidifying into the form of Supreme Dominator Asheric Vil, the ruler of the Threx Dominion. His massive form, draped in ceremony, Zeroscan lowered his head in submission. Supreme One. Asheric Vil's glowing eyes locked onto him, unblinking. "I expected a victorious report," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "Yet here you stand, your fleet broken. Explain." Zyroscan forced himself to remain steady. "The humans are not what we believed." Asheric Vil said nothing, waiting. Zerosi gestured, and the battle footage replayed, the Titans in all their terrifying glory. He watched as the Supreme Dominator's expression darkened, his clawed fingers tightening. "We believed them weak," Zero said continued. "We bombed their city, slaughtered their people. They should have fallen. Instead, they became these." He pointed to the footage, where one of the Titans was tearing through a Dominion warship as though it were paper. "They are not mere machines. They are something more, and they destroyed us." Asheric Vil's gaze lingered on the footage. Then, slowly, a thin smile curved his lips. "Fascinating," he murmured. Zyroskin stiffened. "My lord?" "You see defeat," Asheric Vil said. "But I see opportunity." Zyroskin did not understand. How could this be anything but a disaster? Asheric Vil leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "These Titans, they are beyond anything we have encountered before. Imagine what we could do if they were ours." Realization dawned on Zyroscan. The Supreme Dominator was not concerned with the loss of a fleet. He was already thinking ahead, planning, scheming. "We will capture one," Asheric Vil said. "No, several. We will break their pilots, learn their secrets, strip them of their power." He smiled, his fangs glinting. "And then we will wield it against them." Zyroskin bowed deeply. "It will be done, Supreme One." The transmission ended, leaving the warlord standing in the dim light of his bridge. His fear had not faded, but now it was accompanied by something else, a goal, a purpose. They would return to the human colony, but this time they would not seek to destroy. This time they would seek to steal their gods. Far below, on the scarred remains of Neo Vega, Kai Mercer stood atop the wreckage of what had once been a towering cityscape, his Titan's massive frame looming behind him like a silent sentinel. The battle had ended, but the war had only just begun. He knew they would come back. He could feel it in his bones, in the air, in the way the surviving Threx had fled. Not in the mindless panic of a defeated enemy, but with the calculated precision of warriors regrouping for something more. They had been caught off guard, but they would not remain ignorant for long. The next time they returned, and so would he. The Titans were still operational, standing like colossal guardians across the ruined city, their forms glowing faintly in the dim light. Their pilots, his people, were still coming to terms with what they had become. It was one thing to control a machine. It was another to become one. Sarna approached him, stepping down from her Titan, her expression hard. "The survivors are regrouping," she said. "Scouts report no immediate threats in the sector." Kai nodded. "For now." Sarna crossed her arms. "They'll come back?" "Yes." She glanced at him. And we're going after them, aren't we? Kai exhaled, looking out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the Threks were already plotting their next move. But they were making a fatal mistake. They thought they could control what they did not understand. Kai turned to Sarna, his gaze burning with the same cold fire that had carried him through the battle. "They bombed us," he said, his voice calm yet filled with something dark and unyielding. His Titan's core pulsed behind him, as if answering his words. They thought it was adorable. He stepped forward, the ruins of Neo-Vega stretching beneath his feet, the weight of vengeance pressing heavy on his shoulders. Now we show them what happens next.